Welcome to VMRA Healing. I am your host, Angie Schultz. Today I have public speaker and author Anthea McCarten. Hi, Anthea.
Hi there.
Do you mind sharing just a little bit about yourself and your background?
So I'm a Christian, first of all. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm married, a qualified counsellor. I now facilitate workshops, and they're aimed at both survivors and those who are working with survivors. Have children, two children, adults now in their 20s. That's a very long story condensed into a few seconds, but that's me.
Awesome. So you actually wrote a memoir called How Childhood Sexual Abuse Almost Stole My Sanity and How I Overcame My Past. And it's currently free on Kindle. I will have it in the free in the show notes so you guys can check it out. It's definitely a quick, good read. I read it last night, incomplete. So what is the message you hope that people will get from reading your memoir?
I think the main message that before I even began writing, when I was thinking about writing my story, the main motivation behind it was just giving that message of hope, because I remember how I used to feel when I was in the midst of that darkness, living with trauma. I just felt so lonely, isolated, but also hopeless. I just felt like that was my lot, that was my story, and there wasn't going to be any healing, any future. I when I was in the midst of that, I couldn't envisage healing. I couldn't see beyond, and it was a very scary place to be. And when I was thinking about writing my story, that was my motivation. I just want to share hope that healing is an option and it is possible.
So what was the catalyst for deciding to write your memoir?
So I had a breakdown when I was 30, and I spent 4 years in and out of hospital, a mental health ward. And then after those 4 years, I began to feel better, what I believed to be better. I think the better word to use would be stable. It was the most stable that I had felt ever. But for me, that was a huge progress. What I didn't understand was that I still had a lot of healing to do, sort of a lot of learning about myself, a lot of growth. There was a lot to come, but I just wasn't aware of that at the time. So I remember sitting at my in-laws' house with my laptop and typing away, and the writing was more a cathartic process. It was more like a validating process. So I actually closed the laptop and didn't do any more writing for a few years.
So you mentioned that there is a ripple effect to childhood trauma. Like this was, you basically write about your childhood trauma. But
Yeah.
you mentioned that there's a ripple effect. Can you describe what you mean by there's a ripple effect to childhood trauma?
My goodness, it's when we us survivors speak about the ripple effects of abuse, it is huge. Especially when you're looking at the effects that it has on you as an individual. In the sense that you lose your sense of identity. And the abuse started when I was around the age of 6 or 7. So my identity before that was very much one of being carefree and freedom and fun and happy and joy and all of that. But then when you're abused, that all goes, and your identity becomes something entirely different. And for me, it was one of low self-worth, low self-esteem, fear, rejection, abandonment. That was my value system. That's who I believed I was. I was all of those things. So the ripple effects on yourself is one thing, but then the ripple effects externally when you're looking at family members, So that's my grandfather. So the ripple effects on my parents, on my siblings, extended family, ripple effects on the relationships with those individuals. It's vast. Um, yeah, sorry, what's your original question? What were the ripple effects?
Yeah,
So
you're
in a
answering the question.
nutshell, yeah, in a nutshell, they were the ripple effects. But it goes far beyond that. Your whole world changes everything. Yeah, you're bullied at school because there was a vulnerability in me that bullies detected, and I was an easy target. So there's another ripple effect. A consequence of that was low grades. I left school with barely any qualification. So yeah, it really does go on. It really changes your whole life, every area, every aspect.
I know that one of the things that I really loved about your book is the very first line. And it says, I didn't want my life to end. I just wanted the pain to end. And I think a lot of people can really relate to that. Do you mind
Yeah.
sharing what caused you to say that?
Yeah, so I took a choice. I had a choice when I was in the midst of despair, that I either end my life or I just continue living in the despair. And what I didn't realize, I didn't have enough self knowledge or self awareness at that time to realize that it wasn't that I wanted my life to end, I wanted the pain to end. Um, but through therapy, a really good therapist, she really freed me from the shame of, because there was a lot of judgment, again, the ripple effects from family and friends. But you have so much, you have two lovely children, a wonderful husband, a job. Some people even went on further to say, you go on lovely holidays, you have a lovely car, you have so much going for you. Yeah, so it really was about wanting the pain to end rather than my life to end, because even I was able to acknowledge that, you know, people looking in on my life, it looked good. And I knew that. I knew I had a wonderful husband and two lovely children and everything going for me. But you cannot, when you're living with trauma, you cannot see beyond that.
I talked to Dr. Mark McNear last week, and he talked a lot about the difference between shame and guilt. And I think a lot of people don't realize, what shame is. And how he explained it was guilt is feeling bad about something that you did, whereas shame is feeling bad about who you are. And oftentimes, what we feel shame about has nothing to do with anything that we did. It usually has something to do with what happened to us. And I just thought that was a really good description. One of the things I really appreciate about your book too is it talks, freedom seems to be a huge theme in your book, feeling free. Can you define what freedom was to you and how you achieved that?
Gosh, that's a really big question. Yeah. I mean, I can speak about the here and now and what freedom looks like for me now, but it's very different to how I envisaged freedom to be when I was broken, but two, when I was working through the healing process. Uh, Healing now for me is wonderful. I learned to ride a motorcycle 5 years ago, and that for me, it's not. I mean, yes, the experience of riding a motorcycle is awesome, but when I go back 5 years ago, even to contemplate, right, I want to learn to ride a motorcycle. I mean, in the UK, it's quite a lengthy process. We have to do a CBT, that's for 2 years. We have to do a theory test, and then we have to do a direct access course, which has a mod 1 and a mod 2. It's not an easy process to learn over here and get your full license. And I knew that. And when we earlier we were talking about the ripple effects, and we were talking about self-belief and self-confidence and even self-worth. Am I worth this fun factor or element in my life? I've got so many other responsibilities and the cost and everything, so I really had to take myself back to all the work that I've done. I am worth this, and I can do this. but the beliefs, the old belief system is always there. You know, I think we ask the wrong question sometimes. Many people ask me, clients and people who work with survivors, you know, how do you know when you're healed? It's not so much about I'm healed now. It's an ongoing process every day. We are always healing and working through things. And when things like this come up, where, right, I want to gain full motorcycle license, I had to quieten, not just quieten, but turn the volume off to all those old negative automatic thoughts of, I'm not worthy of this, or I won't be able to do it, I will fail. You know, my husband, I'm so blessed, you know, he offered to pay for it all, and then if I fail, it's a waste of all that money. So I had to turn off those voices from the past and remind myself of all the work that I'd done. So that's how freedom looks for me now. Whereas when I was still living with the trauma, freedom was part of the healing. And for me, it just meant free from the pain, free from the torment. That's, yeah.
What were some of the things that you chose to do to help you achieve that healing? I know you will never fully be healed until the day you die. You will not fully be healed.
Absolutely.
What are some of the things that you have done to help you achieve greater healing?
So the first thing I did after sort of the 4 years of being in and out of hospital, mental health ward, I again I was turning off the volume to those old voices from the past, and I decided to qualify as a counsellor. So that was 4 years of training. And actually, those 4 years, I did so much healing work. Although the therapy that I'd had previously was really good in validating my experiences, acknowledging that they had happened. You know, the therapy helped me work through anger and things like that. Therapy, or qualifying as a therapist, those 4 years, there was a lot of self-awareness work. And we really had to pull ourselves apart and really look at our behaviours and our thought processes and who we were in our interpersonal relationships and things like that. So that was a really although the best 4 years of my life, I have to say I really enjoyed those 4 years qualifying, but it was so painful. So I'll give you one example. When I was broken, the way I dealt with or responded, like a trauma response, if you like, to things that happened in my marriage. If something kicked off, I would shut down. I would alienate my husband. I wouldn't talk to him. I'd go quiet. I'd literally go inside myself. And we were one day, my husband, my daughter, and myself, we were out having dinner, and I can't really remember the conversation, but there was a conversation that happened where I found it quite triggering because of one of the lines my daughter said. And although she didn't mean anything by it, my daughter she's lovely. There's always banter with my daughter, you know, and we have a really, really great relationship. But there was a line she said, well, we were talking about, church and God loving everybody, you know, even the unfavourables or who we deemed to be unfavourable or we don't really gel with. And Millie said, yes, and God even loves the Antheas. And this was when I was training to be a therapist, and it really was textbook, right, I really recognised, whereas before I wouldn't recognise my trauma responses, I really recognised what had happened in that moment. So I walked away from the table, got myself a coffee, and thought to myself, right, how did I used to respond in these situations where I feel triggered, where old little Anthea feels triggered, you know, if she's not of value and little Anthea is unlovable. I know that's not true. And I know that's not what my daughter meant. So how do I deal with this now? I'm finding a new me. This is a whole new territory that was alien to me of actually putting my adult head on and what I'd learned of putting it into action rather than reacting, because it was the reacting that had got me into trouble many times in the past. So I thought, no, walk away, think, pause, and then I relax. So I went back to the table and I said to my husband and daughter, right, what you just said there, this isn't an accusatory comment. I'm not saying this to point the finger. This is actually quite a happy moment for me, because, and then I repeated to her what she said and how I would have responded to that. And I said, but now I'm realizing you were just being you, and it was banter, if you like. And it was kind of a celebratory moment of, this feels awesome. This is what healing feels like. I'm not going to send you to Coventry. I'm not going to sulk. So, yeah, that was, even now, look, you can see it just makes me smile just remembering that day. And just, that was freeing. You know, we were talking about that word freedom. That felt freeing, to be free from the old self. Yeah.
That's so awesome. Another thing I noticed that was a big theme in your book was you often talk about loving little Anthea. And
Yeah.
what type of work did you have to do to learn to love her? And when did you recognize that you needed to love her?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really powerful question, because one example that I use quite frequently is when I was writing my book. And we did, when we were training, there was so much inner child work that we did theoretically. You know, in theory, I had the knowledge there, but I hadn't made that connection with little Anthea. Although I knew and understood inner child work, I hadn't personally made that connection with her. And I was writing a book with my ghostwriter, Marnie, and I knew that I had to do some research. So I got all the old family videos out, and there was one particular bit on there that used to make me cringe. And it's where we're at the park with my parents, my nan, and my siblings, and I'm doing cartwheels, and I'm doing the usual, trying to get attention and validation. And I was like, Daddy, watch me, because he used to work for a company called Radio Rentals. So he was quite lucky and had a video camera. It was back in the 80s. Massive thing it was. But anyway, he was recording all of us. But yeah, my insecurities and, you know, that old message of I'm not lovable and not worth being filmed. Daddy, watch me. And it used to make me cringe every time I watched it. And anyway, I put the videotape in the machine and started watching it again. And I was on my own and I just cried. And for the first time, I felt empathy for little Anthea. I felt compassion. And there's a friend of mine, she's a therapist as well, and I would liken it to her analogy where she said she would literally picture having her little self on her lap and giving her little self a hug. And that's why I was crying that day, because that's, in that moment, that's what I was doing. Instead of feeling repulsed by, because when I looked at little Anthea, all I saw was ugliness and pain and someone who was annoying and irritable, somebody that was, yeah, just annoying to everybody else as well as me finding her annoying when I was watching her. And that just switched, it flipped to, oh God, I love you, you poor thing. It was not in a condescending way, but it was, again, a freeing moment where, right, now I can start doing some real work with, or together, we can start doing some real work together.
That's beautiful.
That was a turning point, yeah.
So you described your diagnosis, I don't know if it was formal or informal, but as complex trauma. Do you mind describing what complex trauma is and how it affects someone, specifically you or people in general?
Yeah, so when I was in hospital and they diagnosed me, I remember the first day I was admitted, and they actually asked me, why do you think you're here? And I was very flippant in my response, which was, well, I don't know, I went through a list of things that had happened to us that year as a family, which was a car accident, a really nasty car accident in Austria. I'd made my best friend's wedding cake. There was all sorts of things that were going on. And I really genuinely believed that everything had just got on top of me and I broke. And they said, well, they're all triggers, but there's something else. And very flippantly, I just said, well, I shrugged my shoulders and it was, well, I was abused as a kid. I had no idea what I had been living with. So that's when they diagnosed me. And also they diagnosed me with obsessive compulsive thoughts because the religion and the trauma together was not compatible at that time. Anyone listening who has been raised in any type of faith really will understand that religion and the teachings can actually magnify the shame that you're living with as a survivor of abuse. There's all that talk about around grace and forgiveness, and I couldn't even forgive myself for much of what had happened. I blamed myself for not being able to say no, or not being able to push him off, or not reporting it sooner, and I had to forgive myself. So when you're looking at complex trauma, when we were talking about the ripple effects, and it's just such a vast topic. But that was my first experience and moment of being sat in that hospital room, of realizing that I was a victim of complex trauma. Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about religiosity. I think it's the same as scrupulosity here. I think it's a UK, United States difference. But one of the things that you had talked about is because your family, it's not that they didn't take you seriously, it's that you guys were so immersed in church culture and religion. And you mentioned that they had a very naive interpretation of what God's forgiveness is. Do you mind sharing that? Because I have a feeling so many people can relate to that, because I think so many people, they think they just need to forgive everybody, and they don't have an idea of what forgiveness actually truly is. And it's not necessarily you may stay in my life even though you did all these terrible things because I forgive you. Do you mind just sharing the impact of that and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. The impact of that was huge, to be honest. So when I had the breakdown at age 30, not too long after that, my grandfather decided, he was very manipulative and always coming out with lies, but he decided that he wanted to become a Christian, but not only become a Christian, but attend my church, which was my safe space. And where I was still broken, I was unable, although my mum and the then church ministers asked me, would this be okay? The broken me, who didn't have a voice, said, yeah, of course. People pleasing. Yeah, of course, I'll be fine. So not only had I lived the trauma of what happened in my childhood, but then I had to continually be re-triggered by him being in my life. Obviously, throughout my whole childhood, you don't have a choice. You're a child, so it's continual triggers of what had happened. And then the breakdown. He'd even come and visit me in hospital, in the mental health ward, and then attended. So I had no freedom from him and from the memories of what had happened. And then at that time, what was also being said to me was that in order for you, or you'll understand this, one of the church teachings is that if we don't forgive others, then God can't forgive us. And as a victim of abuse, I knew that I just could not find it within me to forgive him. As hard as I tried, which magnified the shame again. whatever way I looked in those years, there was shame, different aspects of it, but there was always shame in different contexts. But so that was one. And then when I began therapy outside of hospital, there was a line that my therapist said, which began the whole different thought process of, is he worth forgiveness? And the question she asked me was, does he deserve the title granddad? Because up until that point, I was still calling him granddad and he was still in my life. Yeah, so I've got to be honest, it took me years to process that real message behind forgiveness, to process what forgiveness really meant, to process what forgiveness looked like during my healing process. But what I now understand and what I teach or bring to the table when I'm talking to survivors and people working with survivors is that one of the most harmful things we can do is to tell a victim survivor that they have to forgive their perpetrator or abuser if they are to heal or find healing. And I think that's really damaging, a very damaging message, because it definitely damaged me, because I knew I could not forgive him. And there's a scripture that many Christians seem to forget. It's in, oh gosh, Luke 17, where it's, I wish I'd had it in front of me now, but it's something like, if they are repentant, so whoever's in your life that's hurt you, if they are truly sorry, and as we know statistically, abusers rarely are sorry and repentant and don't want to change and don't change. So here was another freeing process for me, realizing that actually I'm already on my healing journey and I've already worked through so much and processed much, and I haven't forgiven him. So do I actually need to forgive him? And it wasn't so much that it's, because people say they're talking about angerness and resentment and bitterness in your heart. And I didn't have any of those things. I wasn't angry. I'd gotten to the point where I'd let go of the hurt and I wasn't angry anymore. I'm trying to think of the word, indifferent. There really was no feeling. There was no attachment to him. There was no emotion there anymore. I'd been able to walk away, or as I word it sometimes, the crime scene. I'd been able to walk away from that, without holding that angerness, bitterness, and resentment that I used to, because I did used to be very angry, and resent what I had been robbed of. But I'd gotten to the point where I was walking in healing and freedom and full acceptance of what had happened, but I hadn't forgiven him, and that was okay. So yeah, that's my main message really. I think if you're a professional working with victim survivors, and especially if you're from any faith, and especially mine, Christianity, I know not every listener may agree with this, but and I'm not here to preach, but it's my experience, and that's what we're here to share. My experience with forgiveness is, don't tell a survivor they have to forgive.
I know one of the damaging things that I have heard in church is about, I've actually heard pastors say that there is no godly anger. So if you're feeling angry, you are sinning. And I have to admit that in my own journey of healing, I had to feel angry. It was because I had told myself I could not be angry at these people. I had to forgive them, and so I didn't. So anytime anger would arise, I would squash it down, and I was losing my voice. And it wasn't until I allowed myself to be angry, and even angry at people who are very healthy in my life, I had to be able to be angry with them for things I do, because if you're in a relationship with anybody, no matter how great the person is, they're human, they're going to hurt you. And I think too often the church tells us not to be angry, And I think sometimes we do have to be angry in order to move on or to realize, we have worth, we have a voice. And I think that's, it's about not staying there is what it really
Yeah,
is. Moving on.
yeah, it is. Being able to walk away and letting go of everything that was attached with that chapter of your life. And anger is for me, yes, I used to, even personally speaking, my opinion of anger was it was something to be afraid of, because I didn't feel in control of those emotions. Um, but I remember one day, it was the day I reported him to the police as an adult. He'd said something like, she came onto me or she started it, and something just snapped in me. And I was angry, and there was no control over that emotion. That was there. So to then shame somebody and say that's wrong to be angry, that was a normal response to what had happened. But actually, I was able to turn that anger into something positive, and that something positive was a moment of self-validation, and say, actually, I have a voice now, and I'm going to report you to the police, and what you did was wrong. Um, so I think that when we react to anger, it can be quite harmful. But when we take a moment and think that, there's a lot of energy that's running through our bodies when we're feeling angry. But if we can stop, pause, and not react to things and situations, and actually think about, right, how can I use this energy for something positive, a positive move forward, step forward, then anger can actually be a really good thing.
What would you say your turning point for your healing process was? When was the turning point?
Oh, there were so many turning points because there have been years of healing, years of having to process different things. The list is endless, but to name one moment, I think it would have to be back to that moment I mentioned earlier when that therapist said to me, does he deserve the title granddad? Because up until that point, I didn't exist. Um, I had no voice, and I wasn't even able to think for myself. But that was the first moment, and I was about 30, mid-30s, where for the first time she was encouraging me to think for myself. And yeah, I would say that was the first significant turning point of many.
Good. You had mentioned a few in your book. You had a few notations about, little words of wisdom. And one of the things you talked about is watching for signs in your children, their behavior changing, the relationships, like unusual relationships with other people. What are some
Yeah.
red flags that you would like parents to know and to look out for?
I think this is a really important thing to cover because when you look statistically, over 90% of victims of child abuse know their abuser. And one of the things that my parents said, that although they couldn't see the red flags at the time, because this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, when this topic was not discussed, it was brushed under the carpet everywhere. Um, but they described how, looking back now, they can see the red flags. Now they're more informed and they know the subject. So things like before I was 6, they said, you were happy, you were confident. When you had your first day at school, you went and you didn't even look back. You were so excited. I had lots of friends, and then there was a moment that they remember too, where I all of a sudden became introverted, very shy, had no confidence, no friends. So when you're looking or talking about signs, they're signs that they're not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that your child has been abused, but they're signs to look out for if they are. Yeah, like I said, just one minute they're extroverted and then all of a sudden introverted and shy and no friends, scared to see certain people. If one minute they're happy to see that person and then they're scared and they don't want to go near them. They sound very basic, don't they, those signs? But sometimes we just miss them and we'll brush it off as something innocent or something different. But we, as parents, I think it's our responsibility to be mindful of changes in our children's behaviours, as a little individual, but also how they are with other people around them.
I know a lot of that has to do with grooming. Can you describe what grooming is and what to be watching out for?
Yeah, so in my situation, the grooming was I have three siblings, but I was my grandfather's favourite, inverted commas, and I would receive at Christmases or birthdays bigger gifts, better gifts. And my siblings would always, and this is another red flag, if you like, to look out for. Their gifts were significantly smaller or cheaper or didn't cost as much as mine. And then I would get extra pocket money. And I do describe all of this or go into detail on this in the book. But I remember one situation where my grandparents were babysitting and he came up to the bedroom, and the fear in that moment was indescribable. But he didn't do anything. But that time he just slipped 50p in my hand and went, "Shh, don't tell your sisters." So that's one way he groomed me. And another way was just making me feel really special. And I think this is just one of the contributing factors to how, or to explain why I struggle to break the bond and the tie with my grandfather, because he used to make me feel incredibly special because of the time that he wanted to spend with me. He would give me cuddles and not my siblings cuddles. He'd take me on fishing trips or take me to the shop for sweets. And when you're looking at grooming, that is what grooming looks like.
So you actually are working on another piece right now. It's called It Hurts to Heal. Do you mind describing what that is and how you plan to use it for to help others?
Yeah, I for in my early years of healing, I was quite frightened of it because in those first therapy sessions, it was looking at what had happened to me and acknowledging what had happened to me, and that word victim held a very oppressive had a very oppressive connotation for me. And it hurt to first acknowledge that I was a victim and to acknowledge what had happened. That was really painful, because it made me feel powerless. It was like a trigger of how I felt powerless as a child. I again felt powerless as an adult. That hurt. And then when you get deeper into therapy, I had a really great psychotherapist, and we were looking at how the abuse had shaped me as an individual. So we really were looking at those insecurities, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, how it was affecting my relationships, how it was affecting my career, how it was affecting raising my children, how it was impacting the children themselves because they were being raised by a mum who was broken. And it was like putting on new glasses and seeing things for the first time. And what I was looking at in the mirror was visually, was metaphorically, was very hard. What I was seeing wasn't something pretty or beautiful. And when you're faced with all of that, with all the ugliness, with all the shame, with who you are in that place of brokenness, um, you just want to look away. Your automatic reaction is just to flinch away because you just can't bear to look at it. But then you're beginning to think about, right, okay, I don't like it, but I want to change, and I know I don't want to stay in this place. I've got to start becoming self-aware every day and really looking at what this brokenness is looking like in my daily life. So I had to very slowly, bit by bit, and it was baby steps, change how I was feeling about myself, my thought patterns, those negative automatic thoughts. So bringing that all into my consciousness, because up until that point, it had all been buried. I'd suppressed it all, and it had been in the subconscious. So it was all buried. So you're literally digging it all out, dragging it all out. And that word shame again. Oh gosh, do I really react that way? Oh gosh, did I really say that? Did I really let you down here? Right, how can I change that? So that hurt. that whole process was painful because I would have to revisit the same things over and over and over. But the more we revisit and change, the more those changes become habits, and you're not thinking about it so much. Yeah, so that's why healing hurts. It's a personality transplant.
There's
When
there's
you're
actually
healing, yeah.
there's
Yes.
actually a song out by, I think it's called Blue Eyes. It does have some strong language in it, but it says, healing hurts sometimes. Well, it actually says healing something hurts sometime. And the
Yeah.
first time I heard that, it was so beautiful. And it said, um, healing is harder than a full-time, or work harder than a full-time job. And when I was in my deepest moment, even though I do not like that type of language, I had to listen to that over and over because it was
Yeah.
so incredibly powerful to me to hear that song. And if you've never heard it, I would Google it.
Oh, I
Um,
will. Yeah.
but it has strong language, but it also is very intentional, strong language
Yeah.
too. Like,
Yeah.
but I really appreciate that you've been on here. But I do want to ask one last question. And what message would you like to give to others who have had similar backgrounds as you?
Um, there's the book, isn't there? Feel the fear and do it anyway. And healing is scary, and we have an option. We can either avoid that and just continue in those old. The thing is that who I was before I found healing, although it was a dark place and a broken place, it was familiar, and it was I knew it, and I felt comfortable with it, and even there was an element of safety. I knew that I would have to step out of my comfort zone, and it was frightening. So that's why I thought of that book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, because you just have to feel it. There is no other option. You have to feel it, and you have to walk through that fire. Um, yeah, just feel it and do it anyway. It's what makes us all so awesome. Anyone who's listening who is a survivor of childhood abuse, to get to that point where we've survived that. But what happened in our childhoods, we've survived it. So if we can survive that, then we deserve this healing. We deserve a
Yes,
future. We deserve freedom.
I like that. We deserve this healing. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for being vulnerable on here and being vulnerable in your book. I really enjoyed your book. I finished it in 2 hours last night. I was planning on just reading a couple chapters, and it was beautiful, really written. So I ended up reading the whole thing. But
Oh, thank you.
but thank you again so much for being on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's really nice to chat.